Who's on the phone, Chris?
We have Matt calling in from Pittsburgh.
This is Matt.
Yeah, Matt Lutwin.
Matt Lutwin, the superstar first-timer. Hey,
Indeed.
Matt.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Are you real? Is this really your first year?
This is my first year. The last year, I think late November, I discovered ModPo.
Late November, we were done with the symposium mode. Yeah.
Yeah, so I went through some of it on my own, but I just returned to the videos on YouTube, and I've learned a lot in the last year just from that.
Well, Matt, you're amazing. You're a rookie of the year so far. You're really amazing in the forums. You're very devoted to the whole thing. Before you make a point or ask a question to which Kanar, Amber Rose, Jason, and Dan are going to reply, can I ask you what's the? I mean, there are obvious differences, but what's the main difference between discovering ModPo in late November and tootling around through the spring, winter, spring, and summer, and then this symposium mode where we're all together? What are some of the differences you've experienced?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I think the differences are sort of emblematic of like this whole deal for me, and that is that when you're reading poetry sort of in your apartment like I do, and you think about it, you might sort of ask your walls or your cats what they think about the poems, but to read the poems and then to know that maybe in the morning, you can make a post about it or comment about it, someone will respond. To sort of experience poetry reciprocally like that is, I think, just all gravy. For example, in the office hours that I've been attending, we do the close readings in collaboration, and I thought last week, wow, there's no way I could have read Boy Breaking Glass and got out of it what I got out of it in Jason's office hours.
Jason.
And so, yeah, so for me, this is... It's indispensable, and so I'm really grateful for it. I think that answers the question.
Thank you, Matt. It does answer the question. You're terrific. So do you want to make a point or ask a question for the group? And then we'll ask you to hang up and listen to the responses through YouTube.
So this week I've been looking for inroads to the beat poets and the poets in the syllabus. And what I'm thinking about is the element or dimension of sound or voice, the elements that are added to the poem when it is read aloud, and read aloud in the ways that the poems of this week are read aloud. And what that lends to these poems that I think is at least unique among the poems that we've studied so far. So I guess I'm interested in maybe discussing or hearing what other folks think about that new, what is new about the sound or the voice of these poems?
I know I've spent vast periods of time with Ginsberg's Howl repeating in my own head, just because there is something to the delivery of that poem that's really tremendous, but also just it gets you in a certain kind of a groove, and you have to just kind of go along with it despite it being a longer poem, and just sort of listen to the sound of howl, kind of howling as it were. But yeah, I guess I'm a sort of ill-formed thought for the moment is we have the Cortez and the Waldman kind of pieces as well this week, which are in video form, I think, on the ModPo site, but that are actually much more performed pieces, which is just kind of making me think a little bit about what it's like to write poetry in a moment in which the possibility of being recorded as a speaker and as a reader, as a poetic voice, is increasingly easy and sort of widespread. Maybe that leads to sort of these very expansive and unique and kind of often very incredible reading styles, just from a kind of sonic perspective.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kanar. Amber Rose, what are your thoughts on this? This is a big deal, the sound this week.
It's a huge question. Yeah, and it is a really big deal this week. I'm thinking that, so what we have in a poem, right? We have the words, we have the page itself, we have punctuation, and all of those things are adding layers of meaning sound further extends the layer of meaning, right? So when we take a poem like Rogue State, we can read that and have one kind of interpretation of Rogue. But what Anne Waldman does with her voice actually gives us a whole new set of sensory information that then informs how we're able to engage with the poem, what kind of meanings and relations we're able to make with the language that's present on the page. I'm also thinking about Amiri Baraka's Incident, which is a poem that the way that he uses punctuation creates this nearly sonic staccato that amplifies the intensity of the poem, right? So if you were to look at that poem and just read it without any of the punctuation, it still might hit. But what those periods and what those commas do is create a pause that we actually hear and feel that intensifies the kind of shock in that moment. It creates this sort of temporal rupture where the emotional impact continues to build because he interrupts the continuous flow. So that's a moment where we're hearing what the punctuation is doing, and the sonic layer is extending the meaning making in the poem, even without an audio representation.
Oh, snaps. And what folks at home, what Amber Rose Johnson just did is a model, if I may, Amber Rose, is a model for close listening that derives from close reading. Sometimes we think, oh, close listening, I'll listen to Ginsberg perform and I will forget that there was a text. But Ginsberg was very text-based, even though he performed so well. But what Amber Rose did is what I think scholars and critics and theorists are doing now, especially now that there's so much available, so many recordings available, that they become primary, but you want to look at the text and do a phonotextual reading that moves from close reading to close listening. And I just think that's a great, your example of Baraka's Incident is great, because we don't even have a recording of Baraka performing that poem, and yet we know its sound. So great. Amber Rose, thank you. All right, Jason, your thoughts on this?
Two things came to mind. There is, in ModPo Plus, there are two things that I think are really useful for thinking about kind of orality and sound. One is Jerome Rothenberg on sound. So Jerome Rothenberg is really interested in, among other things, oral cultures and poetry that is passed down only orally, where there's not kind of culture of the alphabet or of script writing. So he says poetry becomes the sounding, not the script or part, the preparation or notation, but the sounding. Where there is no writing, the sounding truly renews the poem. And one other thing I found really useful reading under the Clark Coolidge heading in ModPo Plus, the overview of influence of jazz on the beats.
Yeah.
And in that piece, there are three jazz pieces mentioned. Lester Leaps In by Lester Young, Night in Tunisia by Dizzy Gillespie, and Blues for Alice, of which there's a Clark Coolidge poem with the same title, by Charlie Parker. In the piece, it talks about how a lot of these people that we are reading would actually perform their poems with jazz backup, just like in the video, She Got Hot. So I was listening to those three pieces and reading the poems aloud or listening to the audio of the poets reading aloud, and or just reading on the page as the music was playing.
Nice.
Which really helped get a sense of the kind of new rhythms that are at play.
I love that. And I think you're suggesting a practice ever so much as Amber Rose did, a reading practice, going from reading to close listening. Jason's suggesting a way that we can read these poems, having music, perform them yourself, and have music playing not in the background, but as part of the poem. Dan Bergman, Michael, what is Dan saying about all this?
Dan says, as someone who sounds because of my autism, are deracinated from my meaning, I want to point out that in more traditional poetry there is always sound in rhyme and meter accentuating the meaning. But in this week's poems, sound is allowed to push conventional meaning aside to create a more important meaning.